Good afternoon, everyone. I guess it is technically afternoon now. It's an honor to be here at the Louisville Rotary Club. I understand that my classmate, fellow class of 1989 graduate, Wesley Jackson, was an earlier luncheon guest. And I understand that Rotary members, like most engaged citizens, have a deep interest in how the media works, why reporters do what they do, and why the heck do they so often seem to get so many things wrong. I would imagine that many Rotary members, like many engaged American citizens, feel that one major problem with the news media is that it seems entirely too liberal. And there is some truth to that. As I wrote in a previous column for WFPL, if you suspected that the Courier-Journal had a liberal slant to their editorial page, you are absolutely correct. And if you suspect that the national news media leans liberal, you are also correct, but only to a certain extent. Let me explain. So first we have to define our terms. What does it mean to be liberal? Well, the classic definition of liberal from the Enlightenment is one who supports individual freedom and human rights. This is why we see a lot of libertarians and certain types of conservatives define themselves as classical liberals, because their focus is on individual freedom and rights. But when we say liberal here in the 21st century, we usually mean someone who supports these big government social programs dating back to FDR and LBJ. We mean someone who prioritizes, for example, labor and the environment over business interests. We mean someone who is willing to raise taxes on the wealthy to pay for social programs. We mean someone who is mostly anti-war, concerned about the poor and working class. So when we talk about liberals and a liberal media, that's the definition that we use. So now we have to ask, what do we mean by the liberal media? Do we mean that the news media industry is primarily dominated by people who are personally liberal? Or do we mean that the media's coverage usually contains a liberal slant? Or do we just say, oh, there goes the liberal media again whenever they do something we disagree with? I think it's more productive to consider the media's output and not necessarily what the individual members of the media may personally believe. So primarily today, we'll be looking at the types of stories found and the quality of coverage in the media, whether or not it's liberal or something else. But if you do want to talk about what journalists personally believe, it is most certainly true that they are more likely to be socially liberal, which means they're more likely to favor things like the legalization of abortion, gay marriage, marijuana, relaxed immigration policies, and so on and so forth. So I think an interesting question is, are journalists more likely to be liberal, or are liberals more likely to become journalists? I think the profession is more likely to attract liberals, and here's why. One of the many frequently cited mottos of journalism is to afflict the comfortable and comfort the afflicted, which of course sounds like a liberal slogan. And journalism, like teaching, is a sort of social calling for true believers. You do it because you're passionate about it, and hopefully because you're good at it, and not because you want to make a lot of money at it. And so that's why liberals are more likely, I think, in my opinion, to become journalists. So if liberals are more likely to become journalists, then we can predict with some certainty that the content they produce is more likely to have a liberal slant on social issues. And in fact, the research shows that this is true. A recent study by Pew Research showed that recent media reports, were 5 times more likely to report sentiments favoring same-sex marriage this year, just in the past few months. Older studies have shown that journalists are more likely to use language favoring abortion rights groups. So that's no surprise at all. If liberals are more likely to become journalists, therefore they're more likely to say good things about the causes they advocate. That makes sense. But is the news media liberal on fiscal issues? Well, first, let's ask ourselves what a truly liberal media would say about fiscal issues. They would probably talk a lot about income inequality. They would advocate raising taxes and creating economic stimulus that way. They would talk about how Obama has improved the economy. They would provide lots of positive coverage of movements like Occupy Wall Street. And they would interview lots of union officials and workers when it came to economic and business issues. In fact, as it turns out, the news media is not especially liberal on fiscal issues. Less than 10% of stories about the economy mention income equality. The vast majority of Occupy Wall Street coverage was negative when it actually existed at all. Stories about the deficit primarily dealt with the debate over how to reduce federal spending and not over raising taxes. And no matter how you feel about Obama's economic recovery, it's great, it's too slow, it's not fast enough, he did the whole thing incorrectly or whatever, the media hardly ever addresses economic good news. And the media is also far more likely to quote business owners than workers or labor leaders. So as I proceed through my presentation, I'll show you some slides with sources for all of my assertions. Obviously, I don't expect you to write these down or check them immediately while you're sitting here on your smartphone or anything. But I can make a copy of the presentation available to anybody who's interested afterwards. Just come up and let me know, or I'll give you my contact information as well. So we've established the media as liberal on social issues, but not on economic issues. Well, what about war? One would assume that a truly liberal media would be rabidly anti-war all the time. Anytime a politician or general made an assertion about the need for war, a truly liberal media, presumably, would go after them and question those assertions constantly. A truly liberal media, based on our working definition of liberal here, would tell us exactly what conditions might lead to war, what conditions might lead to peace, and it would tell us exactly how many casualties there have been on both sides, because the American public does not like to hear about US body counts. But the US media is not liberal on war at all. When it came to the Iraq War in 2003, for example, the news media largely, there were exceptions, but largely as a general rule, uncritically repeated everything they were told by the Bush administration about WMDs, about the supposed alliance between Saddam Hussein and Al-Qaeda, about the way former NFL player Pat Tillman died in battle in Afghanistan, virtually everything. When it comes to the first Iraq War, back under Bush Sr., the media uncritically reported everything leading up to that too, including the fraudulent reports of Iraqi soldiers tearing Kuwaiti infants out of incubators and throwing them on the cold hospital floor to die. The US news media has been far more likely to host pro-war commentators and experts and retired generals working for defense contractors than anti-war guests. The debates on the news shows were frequently not, should we go to war or should we not go to war, but more like, should we invade now or should we invade later? Should we wipe out the civilian population with carpet bombing or should we use surgical strikes? It's not really a debate if you were expecting a liberal media. The news media minimized reports of civilian casualties throughout the Middle East wars in the past 20-odd years on both sides. And if you really need any further evidence that the media are not liberal on war, remember what happened to Phil Donahue on MSNBC, which most people, I think, rightfully believe is the most liberal of the cable news networks. Donahue was consistently against the Iraq War in 2003, and MSNBC fired him for that reason. MSNBC, not Fox, not CNN, MSNBC fired Donahue for being anti-war. So again, more sources for the claims, and I'll tell you to get a copy of this at the end of the presentation. So we've established that journalists are more likely to be personally liberal. Not all journalists are liberal. Many are conservative, and many are quite resolutely centrist or even neutral on political issues. But it is true that a lot of journalists are liberal. So why isn't their economic coverage or their war reporting also liberal? Well, journalists are more likely to live in cities, and they're likely to be college educated. The Pew Foundation's research has repeatedly shown that people who live in cities and have a college education, there's a strong correlation between those factors and with being liberal. But journalists are also products of the establishment, of the status quo, like most of us. And for their entire lives, they have lived or worked within the American social system, in school and in the workplace. And this system prioritizes obedience. It's okay to rock the boat outside of those everyday hierarchies. For example, your boss at the TV station or the newspaper won't care if you expose some shady car dealer or some corrupt bureaucrat. But it's usually not okay to rock the boat within those hierarchies and those systems. This is true of everyone who has a job, who works within the establishment. I would imagine it's true of the Rotary Club. I'm sure that your organization has a hierarchy that people don't upset without, first of all, a very good reason, and second of all, a lot of powerful allies to sort of back up your insurrection. I seriously doubt that any of you would engage in something that would go against the wishes or interests of Randy Coe or Kevin Wardell or Stuart Alexander or any of the other luminaries of Rotary. And that's perfectly normal. That's what everybody does. That's how organizations work, right? I'm a school teacher, and that's how the schools work. Don't cross the principal, don't upset Superintendent Dr. Huggins, and don't do anything to earn the negative attention of the school board, right? That's how institutions function, as a hierarchy, and everybody within the hierarchy knows their place, and all their decisions are influenced by their place within this hierarchy. This is not a conspiracy theory. This is an institutional analysis. What is the number one goal of anyone who has a job in this economy? Hold on to your job, don't get fired. So you're probably not going to do anything that will contradict that goal. So all of that is prefaced to a very useful way of looking at the US news media, originally developed by Noam Chomsky and Edward Herman. They call this the propaganda model. And there are 5 filters in this model, which help explain why, even though many journalists are personally liberal, their coverage of economic and war-related issues is mostly, generally, decidedly not liberal. So here are the 5 filters. Ownership of the media. Who signs your paychecks? Funding sources. Where does the money for those paychecks come from? In the case of news media, it's either advertisers or donors. In my case, it's the taxpayers of Jefferson County. Thank you very much. Information sources. The currency of journalism is information. And so journalists must cultivate relationships with sources who can provide that information. Flack, which is negative feedback from powerful people in the public. And then this last one, avoid the enemy, originally had a different name when Chomsky and Herman developed their model, but I'll talk more about that later. Let's start with the ownership filter. Now, I would imagine that lots of people in this room are business owners or managers of some kind. Let's say for a minute that you own a hardware store, kind of like Keith's Hardware in the Highlands or Miners J-Town Hardware, which is where I usually go. One day you discover that this guy you hired to work the register is criticizing you and your hardware store and your price structure and everything else. Well, of course, at a minimum, you're going to pull that guy aside and say, what's your problem? Why would you ever say something negative about this place where you're working that signs your paychecks? And even if you didn't fire this guy immediately, which you probably well within your rights to do, you put a whole lot of pressure on him to shape up or shape out, right? That's how it works in any business in the United States, and that's how it works in the corporate media. The majority of the news organizations from which most Americans get their news are owned by corporations who, God bless America, are first and foremost concerned with profits. And why shouldn't they be? That's why they're in business. So, up on the screen here I have several examples of cases where the corporate parent stepped in to interfere with the information side of things. But the thing is, and this is true of all 5 filters, there doesn't need to be any actual censorship for this filter to work. Most of us have the common sense not to upset our bosses in public or publicly criticizing the company and so on and so forth, right? Because we don't get fired. We want to continue to get a paycheck so we can pay our mortgage and our car notes and buy food for our families and so on. And so, of course, journalists are likely to shy away from offending the interests of their company's owners and presidents and executives and so on, because that's how most employees are. And most companies, with only a few visible exceptions like Chick-fil-A and Apple, are really indifferent to issues like gay marriage because it doesn't affect their bottom lines. But they do care about economic issues. Likewise, no company wants to upset the people that are giving it money. That's why we say the customer comes first, or the customer is always right. Because if we take off all of our customers, where's our money going to come from? Now, for most news media organizations, their customers are not their viewers or their readers or their listeners. Their customers are their advertisers, because that's where they get their money from. The advertisers pay the bills. And so not only does this mean that journalists are likely to avoid news that are likely to upset specific individual advertisers, it also means that journalists are likely to avoid topics that might upset advertisers as a whole, such as criticisms of the U.S. economic structure or criticisms of capitalism itself. Now, if we truly had a liberal media, you'd have nonstop criticisms of the excesses of capitalism or reports about the hidden effects of advertising on women and children and the environmental impact of overconsumption and excessive packaging and so on. But you don't see that hardly at all. When you do see stories about the environment, they're very much framed as, here's what you, the viewer, can do about the environmental problems. Recycle, buy a hybrid, eat less meat, and so on and so forth. What you usually don't see from these corporate media institutions are in-depth reports about corporations that may share some responsibility for environmental devastation. And when those reports do get aired, the companies react by withdrawing funds, either in the form of advertising dollars or the form of grants and donations, such as this Koch brothers example up on the screen. Now again, this is not a conspiracy theory, in the sense that the Koch brothers or ExxonMobil or Walmart or whoever sit around in a smoky conference room and say, here's how we're going to censor the media today. That doesn't happen. Companies just aren't going to fund news stories that make them look bad. Why would they? If they did, it would just defy common sense. And journalists are aware of that, just as all employees of all businesses are aware that biting the hand that feeds them is not really a good idea. And it influences their decisions, just as it influences the day-to-day decisions of employees at virtually every business in the United States. Corporate journalism is no different. As I said before, the currency of journalism is information, and that information has to come from somewhere. In many cases, journalists can get information from public records, but in other cases, they have to talk to real human beings, inside sources, leakers, spokespeople, media relations professionals, and so on. And journalists love having access. Who wouldn't feel special and privileged because some high government official called you up and said, I've got a big story for you. It's an exclusive. It's a scoop. Journalists are just like the rest of us in this regard, and that they are susceptible to flattery and special treatment and gifts, in this case, gifts of information. On top of that, journalists have this enormous hungry mouth in front of them every day called the news hole, which is the amount of space in print or time in a broadcast that's left over after all the ads are sold. For a half-hour TV news program, that news hole might be 22 to 25 minutes. For a newspaper, that's 64 pages. The news hole might be 32 or 48 pages. And that space has to be filled with something. You can't just run out of news and sign off. We're going to end the program 13 minutes early because we're out of news. You can't do that. To some degree, they fill it up with wire copy or stories written by national news services, such as the Associated Press or Reuters. But they have to put some original reporting in there. And that's why they develop these intense relationships with sources. And that's where their exclusives and scoops come from, which draws audience attention, and therefore advertiser attention. And why would you want to upset this source? If you have a close relationship with a Washington, D.C. official who's given you scoop after scoop after scoop and really made you a star of the D.C. press corps, why would you or your news organization ever risk damaging that relationship by doing a really fierce, critical, in-depth investigation of that official's particular department? There have been a few really egregious examples of this playful, friendly, collegial, non-adversarial relationship between supposedly tough, critical journalists and the powerful people that they're supposed to be covering. There was the big barbecue that John McCain held for members of the D.C. press corps, and there was the really fun water gun fight between Joe Biden and members of the D.C. press corps. Doesn't that sound like fun? Summer lawn parties with the most powerful people in the United States of America? And that relationship, that inappropriately friendly, dependent, one-sided relationship with a powerful interest that they're supposed to be investigating, is exactly why we don't have the watchdog press, for the most part, that we really need. And that's another one of the reasons why the so-called liberal media isn't really all that liberal when it comes to critical coverage of the economy or foreign policy. So with flack, no one likes to be swamped with negative criticism. Again, I'll return to the business model. If you're running that hardware store and every single customer that comes in complains about your return policy, and you start to lose business because of it, you're probably going to change that return policy, especially if it's unusual or doesn't fit in with the normal return policies of every other hardware store in the area. Likewise, journalists are very responsive to negative feedback. You may be surprised to learn that they are susceptible to the criticism that they're too liberal. One of the ways that they respond to flack is by giving voice to the other side of an issue. Well, some issues don't have two sides. For example, it's a fact that the United States landed on the moon in 1969. I don't think anybody would dispute that, maybe in this room. If you're going to have a news show in 2019 about the 50th anniversary of the moon landing, you really don't need to feature both sides of the story. The side that says that there was a moon landing, and the side that says, in the face of all evidence to the contrary, that there was no moon landing. However, I guarantee you, if there was a sustained public outcry over the media's failure to include both sides, and powerful congressmen and senators denounced the liberal media for their bias on the moon landing controversy, then I guarantee you that many news media outlets absolutely would work to present both sides of the issue where there's only one side. And too many journalists and reporters and commentators simply throw up their hands and say, one side says this, the other side says this, we'll let you draw your own conclusions. Because they really fear this flack, but they shouldn't. Journalists have an obligation to inform their viewers about what is provably true, or what is most likely to be provably true. And so when church officials declare that condoms cause AIDS, or when anti-vaccine groups declare that vaccines cause autism, there are not two sides to these issues. Condoms do not cause AIDS, vaccines do not cause autism, but the media would rather avoid the flack, and so they pretend to be these neutral referees between two equal opposing sides, which is not their job. On the wall of my classroom, I have this quote from Jim Emerson, and you can read it for yourselves, but I'll read you the most relevant part. If somebody says it's 72 degrees Fahrenheit in this room, and his opponent says, no, it's 43 degrees Fahrenheit in this room, you don't just report each statement and leave it at that. You check a thermometer. One of the harms of flack is that it leads journalists to pretend that there are two sides to every issue. There aren't. But there are organized campaigns out there designed specifically to pressure journalists to present both sides of an issue. Remember when there were two sides to the issue of cigarette smoking? Gosh, this side says that smoking is bad for you. This side says it's not bad for you at all. I guess we'll never know who's right. Except the tobacco industry lost that PR battle eventually. But only after years and years of the media pretending that there was false equivalency between the two sides, thanks to flack from tobacco companies and their fake AstroTurf front groups and their lawsuits and so forth. And this flack was in full effect during the Iraq War, 2003. Media organizations that dared to question the administration's assertions were castigated as traitors. And it's still happening today with the Obama administration, but not just with them, but also from other journalists, such as the New York Times reporter who actually suggested that journalist Glenn Greenwald ought to be arrested for his role in reporting Edward Snowden's leaks about the NSA. That's a classic example of flack, negative feedback. And this flack encourages reporters to avoid checking the thermometer, as Jim Anderson described it so wonderfully. So this brings me to the final filter. This used to be called the anti-communist filter because Chomsky and Herman developed this model at a time when the biggest threat to the United States was the Soviet Union. And reporters who challenged White House orthodoxies on Central America, Vietnam, Afghanistan, Grenada, Cuba, and so on were painted as either soft on communism, as communist sympathizers, or even as communist double agents, deliberately working to destroy America by subverting confidence in our institutions, et cetera, et cetera. Then, of course, the Soviet Union collapsed, and now we have a new enemy, which, like communists, are everywhere and all-powerful, and that enemy is terror, or terrorism. So whenever a reporter exposes some utterly wasteful, abusive, or unconstitutional aspect of the war on terror, that reporter is immediately castigated as a terrorist sympathizer or as a useful idiot for Al-Qaeda, frequently by political figures, but just as often by other journalists and commentators within the media itself. And you can see this again in this sort of visceral, rabid reaction to the exposure of the NSA surveillance program by The Guardian and The Washington Post. Instead of turning around and further digging into these incredible claims, the news media largely did two things. First, they simply turned to the government and said, "Is this true?" The government said no. And they said, "Oh, that's good enough for us. Thanks. Load off my mind." And then second, they turned to the people who had uncovered the story and the guy who had leaked the story, Edward Snowden. Have you noticed the vast majority of the coverage of the story is about Edward Snowden and journalist Glenn Greenwald and what they're like as human beings and who they're dating or married to and where they live or where they're going and whatever. Very, very little of the coverage is devoted to confirming the reports or holding government officials accountable. And you can argue that this is because the media is so liberal that they would never dare criticize President Obama, but you're only half correct. Because Fox News or Wall Street Journal coverage is largely devoted to these same irrelevant, personal, kill-the-messenger type stories. Especially because the Bush administration officials like Ari Fleischer and Dick Cheney have come out and supported the NSA surveillance program. The reason the media is doing this is because they're allied with the establishment. It doesn't matter who's in the White House. The media wants to sort of stay in their good graces. They don't want to be seen as unpatriotic. They don't want to be associated with the enemy. 50 years ago, that enemy was communism. 10 years ago, that enemy was Osama bin Laden and Al-Qaeda. And now that enemy is just a big, nebulous, undefinable terrorism, which will always exist and always threaten the United States and always require us to surrender our liberties in order to protect us. Don't ask so many questions. And the news media's essential failure to address these issues throughout both the Bush and Obama administrations, I think, is the great scandal of 21st century journalism and the great rebuttal to the claim that the media is liberal on every single issue. So to review, the Chomsky-Herman model explains exactly why the news media is not liberal when it comes to issues of war and the economy. And the past 12 years of reporting on those two issues provide example after example after example that this is true. There's no denying that the news media is more likely to report favorably on social issues like gay marriage and abortion when it comes to issues that either affect the corporate bottom line or issues of allegiance to power. The media is decidedly and definitively not liberal. And of course, understandably, most journalists are unlikely to admit that these factors influence their reporting. Occasionally you get somebody like Dan Rather admitting on David Letterman's show that his first instinct after 9/11 was to do whatever the president told him to do. Or Josh Marshall of Talking Points Memo, a liberal journalist, admitting that, quote, The US military is the armed force of a political community I identify with and a government I support. But that's rare. Most journalists, like most people, view themselves as proudly independent and totally not influenced by these factors that I've just named. But they are, just like the rest of us are. How many times have you heard a coworker vow that they plan to tell off that boss? I'm going to tell that boss what a jerk. I'll tell him exactly what I think of him. And then how many times did that coworker actually follow through, right? Probably not very many. And if he or she actually did and was promptly fired, the rest of the workers learned a lesson, the same lessons that journalists like Gary Webb at the Sacramento Bee learned when he reported on the links between the CIA, the Nicaraguan Contras, and crack cocaine in Los Angeles. This is during the Clinton administration. When you challenge the official orthodoxy, the backlash and consequences are immediate and long-lasting. So yeah, we all talk a good game, but when we're facing public ridicule, job loss, financial ruin, and so forth, very few of us, journalists included, are likely to rock the boat. So finally, what's our problem with the liberal media? Is the problem that the media has chosen sides, or is the problem that the media has chosen the wrong side? If you believe that the media ought to be completely unbiased, then you're probably equally outraged by everything I've said this afternoon. They shouldn't take sides on social issues, and they shouldn't be excessively deferential to corporate and government interests, right? But if you believe the problem is with liberalism itself, not with bias, and you think that Fox News is a great journalism organization specifically because it mainly provides a conservative viewpoint, then I'm sure you're not on the same page with me. If you think liberalism is the problem and conservatism is the solution as far as journalism goes, not as far as like political or social policy goes, then you're probably upset about the biased coverage of gay marriage and abortion, but you think the coverage ought to be, rather, instead of being neutral, swing in the other direction. We should have conservative coverage instead of liberal coverage, as opposed to neutral coverage. And you're probably not upset at all by the media's deferential treatment of Bush, but outraged by their deferential treatment of Obama. And you think the press are a bunch of unpatriotic scoundrels if they ever dare question the Iraq War, but you think they're spineless lackeys if they fail to question the official Benghazi narrative. If that's you, then still after this entire presentation, and hopefully this hasn't been a waste of your time. But if you think that the real problem is that the press is biased in any way, especially if it's biased in favor of power and the status quo, then I hope today's talk has been of some value to you. And if that's you, here are some ways I think we can solve the problem. First, obviously in this country, we have a lot of media that are openly conservative on social issues. If you think abortion is bad and gay marriage is an abomination, there are all types of websites you can visit, YouTube videos, several newspapers you can read. Of course, there's Fox News and conservative talk radio. For coverage of fiscal issues, I think we should look to independent, nonprofit media that doesn't rely heavily upon advertising or corporate donations. We should look to the international press for foreign policy coverage, and in every case, we should be looking at a variety of sources. Getting your news from one place only, most of the time, is like eating at one specialty restaurant every day for the rest of your life. Expand your horizons. I also think that as consumers of media, we ought to be providing specific critical feedback of the news media. Now, if you're going to send your local TV station or newspaper an email that says, "Stop trying to impose Obama's socialist, Kenyan, Muslim conspiracy on the American people," they're either going to ignore you or laugh at you. In the Courier-Journal's case, they'll print your letter and then laugh at you. But if in your letter you lay out very specific facts that they got wrong, and you cite reputable independent sources, and they get a lot of letters like these from a lot of their readers, they'll have to pay attention. Even though most major news media get their funding from advertisers who are their true customers, advertisers are only interested in media that actually have an audience. And if that audience goes away, advertisers will also go away. And so corporate news media will pivot on that point and start to give us what we tell them that we want. So if you'd like to get in touch with me, here's my email, my Twitter account. I hope you'll read my media criticism columns on WFPL.org. If you'd like a copy of this PowerPoint presentation, please email me. I'll be happy to send it to you. Thank you so much for inviting me here today. It's been an honor and a privilege, and if we have any time left, I would love to answer your questions. Thank you.